this applies to. When the people who are supposed to be the ones who loved us most and protected us from the evils of this world became the very monsters we needed saving from, it changed everything about how we saw ourselves and lived our lives. They taught us that love was dangerous and something to fear, that trust was just a way to lure us into the danger zone, and safety was only found in fairy tales. So we learned to bury our real selves deep inside of us, and we kept them protected under lock and key, because if no one could access the most intimate parts of our hearts and minds, then it didn't matter what happened to us physically. They would never touch the parts that really mattered. We've now taught ourselves the survival strategy we will try and live the rest of our lives by. But this same strategy that we think keeps us safe is also what is killing us slowly. Life without genuine emotional connection is not life, and it is not the way we were ever created to live. So we chase after the love that we yearn for, but we never dare to let anyone in close enough to actually have it. Eventually we realize that we are the problem, but we misinterpret that to mean that we hold the blame for what has happened to us. So we start to live out that shame and guilt by choosing people who use us as the excuse for their behaviors, and who deal out the punishment that we think we deserve. And we believe we are doomed to live this existence forever. But God, y'all, one day God steps in, and our eyes are opened, and we can finally see and feel what true love is. And then we learn to see ourselves through His eyes. And in time, we start to understand just how real His promise to protect us is. He changes everything. We just gotta let Him. Amen. This is my story, but it is also the story of countless hurt, scared, and shamed children and adults. So today I share my testimony so that you can understand that person in your life that you keep wondering why they allow this to happen to them. They know they can walk away. Why do they keep going back? But most of all, I share this for those of you who are still walking in the shoes that I wore for over half of my life, who are struggling to believe that they deserve more and that a better life really can be theirs. Now that I've already got myself crying, I'll go into the actual testimony. I was born to an Italian immigrant family. I was actually the first American-born member on either side of my family. I have a younger biological sister. I had an amazing but traumatized and very damaged, that got all messed up, sorry. I have an amazing but traumatized mother and a very damaged Vietnam vet as my father. My father was a heavy alcoholic and a very violent man whose rage became worse when he drank. One of my earliest memories was being about 5 years old. My father had come home from the bar in the middle of the night drunk. I guess one of my shoes wasn't lined up perfectly under the radiator the way that he liked them. Got kicked aside, or maybe I just didn't put it in there perfectly straight, I don't know. But at that young of an age, I woke up in the middle of the night to his fist hitting my face. He broke my nose that night. He left me with this slightly off-kilter nose and this scar over here so that I never forget what my life with him was like. There were lots of other moments like this with my father. We pretty much always lived in fear of saying or doing the wrong thing because he never really knew what was going to set him off. He also demanded perfection, and nothing was ever good enough. If you got an A, he wanted to know why it wasn't an A+. If you got an A+, he wanted to know why you weren't putting enough attention on something else. This is the beginning of where my lessons in people-pleasing started. The shining light in my early years was my mother. She loved us fiercely. And she went out of her way to try and make up for the things that we endured with my father. Holidays were always over the top. She would do the craziest things, like at Easter she would take a rabbit's foot, dip it in baby powder, and leave little Easter bunny trails going across the carpet of our room. Or when we lost a tooth, the tooth fairy would leave us a thank you note that was written on vellum paper that was dusted with glitter and baby powder. My teenage years, I used to think that the reason that I was gifted with a mother that went the extra mile like that all the time and always made sure that we knew how special we were to her was because God knew that her time was going to be so short with us. So he made sure that we had somebody that would give us everything and then some in those short years. As I got older, I started to understand that part of it was because she had the same damage that I did. She lived with that same violent man that I did. And she wasn't ever able to find the strength in herself to protect us. And so she made up for it by doing all of these extra things. In my 20s, I dealt with some anger over that. I resented her for a while. Part of me even hated her for it. And forgiving her was a long and hard process. It was only as I started being able to forgive myself that I was really able to understand her and forgive her. Sorry. For several years, life at home also held another danger. As if the terror of my father's rage wasn't enough, my little sister and I also had to live through the terror of sexual abuse from our uncle. Between him coming into my room at night and my father coming home drunk from the bars in a rage, nights became the most dangerous time of my life. It's a terror that would carry its effects all the way through, even into my first few years with Brian. Brian and I quickly learned that we needed to adopt a pattern of me going to bed, or him going to bed before me, because whenever I'd go to bed first, my subconscious would still click into that self-protect mode. And he'd walk into the room and I would know something was off. And still asleep, I would sit up and start screaming. Full-on night terrors. I'd lay down suddenly, go right back to sleep, mid-scream. Does that understand it? Wake up in the morning with no recollection of any of it. So basically, I'm responsible for Brian developing some trauma issues of his own. My mother passed away of dilated cardiomyopathy when I was 9, and my sister was 6. I have never felt so confused, scared, and alone in my life. The woman who always had such a quick smile, warm heart, who made holidays so special, who would read Bible stories to us in the bath, and a million other little things that I can still remember so vividly to this day, was gone. I was left with the sole responsibility of dealing with my father and trying to protect my sister at the ripe old age of 9. I was blessed to have had a mother who made it a priority to teach me how to take care of myself medically. Understanding how to care for and treat my type 1 diabetes would be the only reason that I would stay alive over the next several years. I remember at the gathering after my mother's funeral, I was out on the porch alone and crying. My paternal grandmother came out and quickly scolded me for it. She made it very clear to me that I was now the woman of the house. My father had lost his wife, and my sister was younger than me, so losing my mother was worse and harder for both of them than it was for me. I needed to toughen up and take care of them. This was where I first learned the lesson that my problems and needs and my values were less than everybody else's. This is another belief that I would take with me for decades. Only a few months later, my father remarried a woman of 21 years old, who apparently was not loving life raising someone else's kids. So my father's solution was to get rid of the problem. He dumped my sister and I off downtown with a backpack of belongings each, and he never looked back. We each started spending nights at different friends' homes, and it wasn't long before I lost track of where Jenny ended up, and I never saw her again. Eventually, one of those parents called child services, and my foster life began. I officially became a garbage bag kid. I remember that they had tried reaching out to aunts and uncles, but in my family, sweeping the ugly secrets under the rug was pretty much the family motto, so they had to start placing me in foster homes. I understand that foster care has come a very long way. Miss Kathy that has the kids is one of the most amazing, loving, and giving foster moms I've ever known in my life. But back then, the foster system was a terrifying and dangerous place. Most of the times, it was more terrifying than life at home. At least at home, I knew who and what the dangers were. By the time I was 14, I was placed in my 11th home in 4.5 years. In those first 10 homes, I had learned a lot. I learned that you always had to look presentable enough to meet the foster mom's approval, but never pretty enough to make her or the older girls in the home feel threatened by you. I learned that being medically self-sufficient and never crying about being sick or even showing it if I could help it was the key to me not being seen as a burden. I learned that making myself small, never in the way, and quick to help mattered to the mothers. And I learned that making myself invisible was the only chance I had of not drawing the attention of the fathers. I also learned that the other foster kids were not my friends. We were not allies. I was a threat to their position in the home, so I'd better fall in line quickly. I learned that there were monsters out there far worse than even my father or uncle could have imagined. But mostly I learned just how disposable I was. Just before my 15th birthday, I was placed in what would end up being my final placement, my long-term placement. Mama Linda and Daddy Jerry were people with more love than could ever be limited to a small family, so on top of their own children, they also adopted, as well as had anywhere from 4 to 10 of us foster kids in their home during my years with them. There was never a moment that any of us wanted for anything. For the first time in my life, there wasn't anyone beating or molesting me. Mama Linda was a Catholic, just like my parents, so my church life resumed immediately. The Roman Catholic religion was a hard and distancing religion back then. I understand that going through some changes now, but back then it was a very cold religion. Having a personal relationship with God was not something we were taught. In fact, as congregants, we were so low on the totem pole that we needed intercessors for everything. If we needed forgiveness, we had to go to a priest who was more important than us so he could intercede on our behalf and ask for forgiveness for us. If we had a special prayer request, we prayed it to the Virgin Mary because, once again, she was more important than we were, so she could intercede on our behalf, and God would listen to her. So long as I behaved, I skipped a part. All of this just reinforced my belief that I was less important than others. I was not worthy. But there was something about the definitive way they approached salvation that I found a strange sort of comfort and peace in. So long as I behaved and I didn't get too many sins marked off against my soul, I could go to heaven. Then I'd be with my mother again. I clung desperately to that. That was the secret place that I would run and hide to in order to get by. Like all foster kids, I aged out of the system at 18. Back then, we all received a 2-week motel voucher and a very small amount of cash to start our lives with. At the time, I didn't understand that this was a ridiculous system that pretty much guaranteed failure. I just thought that it was more proof of how much of a failure I was that I couldn't figure out how to make it on my own. I needed to find a solution. I needed to find someone who was smart enough to live the adult life that I could. So less than 6 months later, I married my first husband. He was a perfect fit for the profile of all the men that had been in my life before him. He was controlling, mentally, emotionally, and physically abusive. And every day that we were together was another day furthering my belief that I was the problem. I just wasn't as good as other people were. And if I could just be better, then I wouldn't make people so angry. I truly believed that I deserved the treatment that I received. And even worse, that my flaws forced him to become as angry as he did. Then we found out that I was pregnant, and I was so happy, y'all. I'd finally be able to do something right. I'd be able to give him a child. It didn't matter to me that at the time pregnancy was still considered a quite possible death sentence for type 1 diabetics. I was going to find a way to make this work. 2 months later, I had the first of many miscarriages throughout my life. The fact that in the process of this, I almost died and spent 6 weeks in the hospital meant nothing to my husband. The only thing he saw or knew was that I had caused his child to die. I didn't even try and argue with them because I was blaming myself too. Instead of heeding the warnings of doctors, I kept trying to have a baby. I became obsessed with it. I had convinced myself that if I could have a child, it would somehow prove that I was worth having around and that my existence meant something. Thankfully, a friend did see the worth in me that I couldn't see in myself. And because of her, I ended up in a battered women's shelter. And he filed for divorce. I didn't know how to handle that. I was brought up Catholic. Divorce is the only thing worse than divorce for a Catholic is suicide. Divorce is something you can't come back from. You can't be forgiven for. You're just doomed. You're going to hell. And that's all that I knew. Divorce was a sin and I was going to hell. I tried to make a life for myself. I got a job. I shared an apartment with a roommate. But nothing erased that doomed feeling inside of me. No child was going to save me now. There was no longer a point to trying to find a way to redeem myself. This led to a suicide attempt. Not a cry for help attempt, but a genuine, sincere attempt at dying. If it wasn't for what could have only been God stepping in to save me, I wouldn't be here today. You can still see the faint scars on my wrist to this day, 16 on the left and 14 on the right. But we didn't have a knife in the house that was sharp enough to get a deep enough cut. So I moved on to other means. I swallowed every single type of medicine there was in the house. I injected all of the insulin that I had on hand. And I drank what remained inside of each of the 3 cleaning bottles that we had. I remember falling asleep on the couch. But I don't remember my roommate coming back home when she was supposed to have been gone out of state for the whole weekend. I don't remember the paramedics or even the ambulance ride to the hospital. The next thing I remember was waking up a few days later in ICU and being told that if my roommate had come home even 20 minutes later, I wouldn't be here. I remember being so angry at her. I hated her for coming home. I hated her for the fact that I was still alive. Because my attempt was so severe, I wasn't put on the standard 15-day psych hold. I was put on a 45-day mandatory hold. In the end, that time doubled, and I spent 90 days inpatient. I was diagnosed with PTSD, chronic depression, and severe anxiety disorder. Shortly after being released, I started working the desk at and attending a Salvation Army church. This is where my life as a true child of God would begin. I remember I was sitting in the pew while the captain was preaching a sermon from 1 Corinthians, and I just kept inching further and further till I was practically falling off of the pew seat. Tears just streaming down my eyes, terrified I was going to miss a word of what he said. I'd never heard anybody talk about God with so much love before. The idea of him actually loving me was so foreign to me that I almost couldn't breathe. I went home that night, I opened up my Bible to 1 Corinthians, and I started reading for my life. I read it over and over and over. And by the time the sun rose, I moved on to what would become the most transformative scripture in my life. Psalm 68:5, a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. I can't even tell you how many times I read that verse that night. I had it memorized that night. It was the first and one of the very few verses I've ever managed to memorize. By the time that the sun rose, I had found John 14:18. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. When I got to work that day, I was still so excited that I started sharing all my discoveries with the lieutenant. Because, being a minister and all, she wouldn't have the first clue about these verses, that they existed or what they meant. Then she told me the story that would be the final piece that made the whole puzzle fit for me. You can go ahead to the next slide. She told me the story of a woman with the blood disease and how in Mark 5:34, Jesus called her daughter. She explained to me why this was so significant. How with this one word, Jesus had taken the shameful stigma of unclean, unwanted, outcast away from her and claimed her as a chosen child of God. I finally got it. I'm not an abandoned orphan with a father who doesn't love or want me. I'm the daughter of a king who loves me fiercely. This is where my story really begins. This was the start of my healing. This is when my past was wiped clean, and I no longer had to live in that shame of being unclean and unwanted. I had been made new, and I was a child of God. Yes. I wish I could say that it was an easy road to a healthy life from there, but it wasn't. I went through a series of bad relationships, believing that because I wasn't getting hit, I was no longer being abused. After living with a man for several years who was emotionally abusive and controlling, I finally started to understand and believe that I still deserved more. For the first time in my entire codependent life, I chose to be alone. I stayed alone for almost 2 years, and it was the most amazing experience. I finally learned who I was. I found out that I had dreams. I had goals. My relationship with God grew closer and stronger every day. This was when I met Brian. There's a lot of different things that have let me know over the years that Brian was definitely the man that God had created specifically for me, but this is one of the big ones. When we came into each other's lives, I was just shy of 2 years into my new life as a free woman of God. Brian was just shy of 2 years of his new life clean from his addiction. We grew together, we healed together, and eventually we shared a Christian life together. Brian, bless his heart, has had to deal with a lot of my leftover trauma. But he's been a huge part of the reason that I've recovered as much as I have. Come on. Yes. I don't have it all together, and I haven't completely finished healing, but I am no longer that scared little girl that I was for the first 30 plus years of my life. I no longer feel the need to change myself in order to try and keep others happy so that they still want me around. I no longer see myself as the reason for everything bad that happens in life. It took a lifetime of breaking me down to get me to the place that I was at. So I understand that even with God being the one putting the puzzle together, it's a slow process that takes time. I will continue pushing forward and working on each new piece as he lays it in front of me. There's a whole other part to my testimony, and maybe one day I'll share it. There's a lot that went on in my adult life, choices that I made, things that I allowed to happen to me. And that's the key words right there. I allowed them to happen. I chose to let myself be in those positions, in those situations. But today, what I needed to explain when God stopped me, actually when I was trying to write my chronological testimony. He let me know that this is what I needed to tell. This was the story that I needed to bring out, everything that I'd kept buried for all of these years. I I needed to be able to make sure that people understood, because we talk a lot about codependency, and we talk a lot about people pleasing and recovery. And I need y'all to understand that there is a process to these behaviors starting. None of us just woke up and became codependent one day. We didn't wake up and decide that we were going to live our lives trying to be a people pleaser. There were a million different things that happened that brought you to that place. And it takes a lot of tough work, and it takes a lot of digging in deep and letting God be your guide in order to work through those so that you can start walking in the true freedom of being a child of God. So I hope that today, if there's anybody who is still stuck in any of my old patterns, that you can see that there is a way through and there is a way out. Come find me and I will be so happy to share the love of my Lord with you.
Yes.
If you know anybody who's walking this life, if you know somebody who's struggling in it, maybe by hearing my story, you'll understand that it's not just a matter of, well, they choose to stick around. There's so much more to it, and maybe you'll have a little bit more patience for them and a little bit more understanding. And with that, I'm done squalling.